I start with a few words of introduction, but I'll be brief. Tervetuloa tähän vierailuluentoon. You are all welcome to attend this guest lecture by Dr. Cyril Hovorn. He has flown here from Africa via United States, but is located currently in the States, in Los Angeles, where he runs the Huffington Institute of Ecumenical Studies, and is not here in Joensuu for the first time. Some of us have had the pleasure of meeting him earlier times during his various reasons that because of his various visits here in the earlier years in regards to cooperation of theological schools and other theological expertise that he has been sharing with us here at the School of Theology. And today his topic is related to anti-Semitism. The title is projected there on the wall, and I won't be keeping him any longer. After his presentation there is a chance for questions and answers. Who presents the questions, who gives the answers, we will learn them. So once again, you are very welcome. And Father Cyril, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Pekka. Thank you. Well, it is a great privilege and honor to be here again. I remembered last time I was a couple of years ago, and I presented on the church-state relations, the symphonic models of relations between the churches. It was another topic related to what we can call public theology or political theology, a strange marriage between the political and theological and religious. And today's topic I chose it actually as reflecting the same set of problems related to political and religious, to political and theological. I should confess that this presentation reflects my recent work, my recent study, which I just finished. It's a part of my new book, which is to be published very soon in the United States by Fortress Press. The book's title is Political Orthodoxies, and I explore different sorts of alliances and misalliances between the Orthodox Church and the political environment in the recent decades, well, more specifically during the 20th century. And anti-Semitism is one of such political orthodoxies, I believe. It is one of those doctrines that emerged out of this merge of political and religious. Anti-Semitism, I believe, is, and it is not a big secret, is widely spread among the Orthodox. And as a matter of fact, even though, as I said, I studied this phenomenon mostly during the 20th century, it is much older than the 20th century. It goes back to the first Christian era, to the early Christian era, to the first centuries of Christianity. When Christianity looked for its distinct identity, Christianity emerged as a Jewish sect, essentially, as a sect within the Jewish religion. And its relationship with the Jewish religion was complicated. First, it did not distinguish itself from the Jewish setting. The early Christians, the early disciples of Jesus, perceived themselves as Jews. They were Jews, and they perceived themselves not really as Christians. We know that only later on, and we know this from the Acts, which is from the Acts of the Apostles, which is quite a late book, that gradually they began distinguishing themselves from the Jewish setting. And it was a painful process, and it was not a process that was accepted by everyone. We know this for instance, from the conflict between Peter and Paul, how they represented two different points of view on Christianity vis-a-vis Judaism. In particularly, it seems that Peter was more in favor of the Jewish identity of Christianity, and Paul was more about going forward, stepping beyond that identity to the pagan world, to the Roman world. We can say that even the word church that the church adopted for itself reflects this struggle. The Greek word ecclesia is the translation of the Jewish Kahal Yahweh in the Bible, in the Old Testament. And it's interesting that the Christian community chose for itself to identify itself, not the Jewish word Kahal, which was more kind of obvious. It would be more normal for the Christian church to call itself Kahal, for instance. But instead, the Christian community chose for itself the word ecclesia. And quite strangely so, because ecclesia is not just a Greek translation of the word Kahal. Ecclesia is a word, it's a very important term in the Greek political culture. Ecclesia was the Greek parliament. It was the place where the citizens of a polis, of a Greek polis, would come together and decide different political issues pertinent to their city. And Christians referred this Greek political term, ecclesia, to the more biblical kahal. And this, I believe, was done, among other reasons, because of the struggle about identity, whether the Christian community should be identified with Judaism or should not. We find a very strong, this term appeared at a later stage, quite a later stage of the development of the early Christian community. From the same stage, we have some anti-Jewish treatises and texts, like, for instance, the Epistle of Barnabas, or the treatise a bit later, treatise by Melito of Sardes called Peripascha on the Easter, which is very anti-Semitic, we could say, we could put it in this way. At the same time, I would argue that the modern Orthodox anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism that emerged in the 20th century, and the sort of anti-Semitism that many Orthodox still share nowadays, even though they don't speak openly about their anti-Semitic views, because after the Holocaust you cannot be openly anti-Semitic, but latently inside the community anti-Semitism is still widely spread. And I argue that this sort of anti-Semitism is different from the sort of anti-Semitism that we find, for instance, in the Epistle of Barnabas or Melito's Peripascha. My argument that the pre-modern anti-Semitism, this anti-Semitism that existed, that developed in the pre-modern era, before modernity, and the modern anti-Semitism, they are very different. Yes, pre-modern anti-Semitism rejected the Jewish religion as religion. At the same time, if Jews converted to Christianity, they were fully embraced by the Christian community. They had the same rights, the same privileges that the rest of the Christians had, with no distinction. They could be promoted to very high ecclesial positions. They could become patriarchs. They could become any sort of ecclesial officials, despite their Jewish background. Well, apostles were Jews. Jesus Christ was Jews himself. That's why it was very natural to be promoted to any position. But the modern anti-Semitism is different, because the modern anti-Semitism, I believe, it rejects Jews not on the grounds of their religion, but on the grounds of their nationality, on the grounds of them being another people, another nation, and another ethnos. And from the perspective of modern anti-Semitism, Jews are seen not as a religion, but as a people. And exactly because of this idea, for instance, Jews, even if they are converted to Christianity, they were not fully embraced, received in the Christian communities. They were still seen with suspicion as not quite Orthodox, as not quite Christians. And that's how the modern idea of nation, a secular idea, because the idea of nation is a secular idea. It's a secularized version of the Christian concept of genus, of the people believing in the same religion. That's how this idea of ethnos influenced the perception of what is to be a Jew in the modern times. So essentially the modern anti-Semitism, which we mostly know, is a secular phenomenon. Unlike the pre-modern anti-Semitism, which was a religious phenomenon. We can still argue about validity, about how wrong was the pre-modern anti-Semitism. From the modern perspective, pre-modern Semitism was still anti-Semitism, was still, because for us it would lead to the modern ethnic anti-Jewish as people anti-Semitism. Of course, from the perspective of modern dialogues that we have with Jews, we would not probably share the same opinions that we find in some even patristic texts, like this Epistle of Barnabas or some writings of John Chrysostom, which were very anti-Semitic. We could probably disagree even with some liturgical texts nowadays, which are very kind of anti-Semitic, especially in this period of the Easter, right? But I think what we need to do, we need to distinguish, we need to make a clear distinction between that pre-modern anti-Semitism and the modern anti-Semitism. And quite strangely, even though this modern anti-Semitism is largely a secular phenomenon, and it was articulated by people who had been secularized heavily in the 19th century, because the ideological foundation of this modern anti-Semitism, they were laid down in the 19th century in the process of secularization, and many secular minds were behind this anti-Semitism. Moreover, quite interesting that behind this anti-Semitism we could find some advances in science, in scholarship in the 19th century, like for instance biblical criticism. People like Bauer from Tübingen School, who introduced this idea of biblical criticism. He was also an anti-Semite. People like Renan, for instance, the famous author of the Life of Jesus. He was a profound, a very kind of up to the roots anti-Semite, because they argued that Jesus Christ was not quite a Jew. They argued that he was more like Aryan, and this led eventually to the idea of, supported by the German scholarship under Nazis, that they tried to kind of deconstruct the Jewish identity of Jesus Christ. Some modern developments in science, like Darwinism, contributed to anti-Semitism, because Darwinism essentially introduced the idea of race. And from this idea of race, the modern idea of anti-Semitism sprang. So we see how the secularizing and secular phenomenon in the 19th century contributed to this new anti-Semitism. I will unpack this in my lecture in more detail. I just want to stress this point, that modern anti-Semitism is a secular phenomenon. And even though it is secular, it is widely embraced in the church circles. And this is one of those things that we can call the church as the agent of its self-secularization. The church then becomes a promoter of secular phenomenon within the church that lead eventually to secularization from within the church. A part of anti-Semitism, nationalism, is such a phenomenon. Nationalism is a secular phenomenon, because the idea of nation is a secular phenomenon itself. It's different from the original pre-modern concept of the Christian genos, the Christian group of people who believe in God. And when the churches promote nationalism, they essentially promote a secular phenomenon, and they become an agent or agents of their own secularization. The same is with the modern anti-Semitism, I believe. So this is a bit of kind of a hypothesis that I want to prove in the course of my presentation. And I will study, in order to prove this hypothesis, I'll study two cases. the Russian case, the case of the Russian anti-Semitism and the case of the Romanian anti-Semitism. Those cases do not exhaust the entire spectrum of our Orthodox anti-Semitisms. It is very wide and colorful, this spectrum. But those two cases are indicative, and they are important in order to trace the influence of the Orthodox anti-Semitism on the global anti-Semitism. Because another hypothesis of my presentation is that the Orthodox anti-Semitism contributed significantly to the rise of Nazi anti-Semitism. And I will try to show you why it happened and how it happened. But first of all, let us go back to history. And let us go back to the first recorded pogrom, anti-Jewish revolt. It is not the first pogrom ever, of course, but it is one of the first pogroms that occurred in the era of secularization, in the era when the concept of nation emerged and was adopted, embraced by the Orthodox people. This pogrom happened in 1821 in Odessa. And the circumstances of this pogrom was that after the Patriarch of Constantinople, the martyr, Gregory V, was murdered in Istanbul, in Constantinople, by the Ottomans, because, as you know, the patriarchs, they were responsible for the entire people they were in charge of as ethnarchs. And the Greeks revolted against the High Porte, against the Ottoman Empire. They wanted their own independent state, and the patriarch was accountable for that, and the Turks hanged him as a part of kind of this accountability at the gates of the Patriarchate. Gregory V was a wonderful patriarch. He was really, unlike many other church figures at the time, he was really loved by people. And out of the respect to him, Greeks brought his body to Odessa. Odessa was a place where many Greeks lived, and probably you know the Helikieteria, the group of Greeks that were behind the Greek Revolution of 1821. They were located in Odessa. So they brought his body to Odessa, and they brought this body around the city of Odessa in order to make people to venerate his body. And the Greeks who were many of them in Odessa, they noticed that the Jews of Odessa did not pay due respect to the body. And this became a pretext, a reason for them to launch the pogrom against the Jews. 17 Jews were reported to be killed in this first pogrom. Of course, one can argue that probably this seemingly not quite respectful attitude of Jews to the body of the Patriarch Gregory V was not the reason, but maybe an excuse to solve some, problems of competition, especially in trade between Jews and Greeks. But it's a different story. The fact remains is that there were 17 Jews who were killed by the Greek merchants, Orthodox merchants, because the Greek merchants accused the Jews that they did not venerate properly the body of the Patriarch Gregory V. Actually, they were facilitated also by some local people, non-Greeks who lived in Odessa. The new wave of pogroms happened after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. This assassination, as it is depicted here on the picture, was accomplished by a ethnically Russian person whose name was Nikolai Rysakov. He was a leftist. He was a radical left guy. And even he had no relationship to Jews or to Jewish religion. He was a nihilist, obviously. But many people believed that Jews were behind this assassination somehow. And among those people who believed in this was actually the son of the assassinated Tsar. who would become Alexander III, the successor to the throne. So Alexander III himself believed that the Jews were behind this assassination. And this belief spread throughout the palace, went beyond. And many people, as you know, people are sensitive to what do they think there in the palace. They're still sensitive to what the Tsars of Russia think, and they try to implement their perception of what they think in the real life. And that's how many people who sensed this grief of Alexander III about his father and sensed this conspiracy and shared this conspiracy theories that Alexander III had, they launched a series of pogroms in the period of 1881-1884. It's interesting that the pogroms were supported by not just by ordinary people, but many intellectuals as well, many literati people with university education. Only a few intellectuals then resisted and denounced the pogroms. Only a few, actually, among a wide group of educated people in Russia. Among them were, for instance, the famous writer, satire writer Mikhail Saltykov-Shchedrin. He actually publicly denounced those pogroms, and in this regard he was a hero. Alexander III was not alone on this high level of power to believe that the Jews were behind the assassination of his father. He was inspired to believe so by his spiritual and intellectual mentor, Konstantin Pobedonossev, who was a tutor to Alexander III. He was hired to teach the young prince by Alexander II, and under Alexander III he was promoted to the position of the Oberprokuror of the Holy Synod, the main person in the church. Pobedonossev was a notorious anti-Semite. He never denounced anti-Semitism. He openly expressed his anti-Semitic views. And he actually told many times to Alexander III that there are Jews behind all those attempts to change the monarchical rule in Russia. Pobedonossev had a body, a single-minded person, a person who shared with him the same ideas, and this person's name was Fyodor Dostoevsky. We have letters where they exchange their anti-Semitic views. It's interesting, I found one letter after which Dostoevsky wrote to Pobedonossev after he visited Berlin. And he complained to Pobedonossev that Berlin has too many Jews, and the Jews played too important role in the German society in Berlin at the time. Dostoevsky's anti-Semitism is a very interesting phenomenon. It is really, really important to understand his anti-Semitism because it became a ground for many other anti-Semites, especially in the Orthodox environment, in the Orthodox circle. His anti-Semitism was not unique, however. It was in tune with the anti-Semitism of many other intellectuals in Europe at that time. I would draw the closest kind of parallel between his anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism of Richard Wagner in Germany. They were very close in their views. Both Dostoevsky and Wagner did not express their anti-Semitic views in their main opera. For instance, the most anti-Semitic piece of Wagner is regarded Percival. But still, you don't see open anti-Semitism there. The same, you don't see open anti-Semitism in the works of Dostoevsky. However, in their articles and diaries, you find plenty of anti-Semitic views. And they produced a system of anti-Semitic views in their non-creative, as it were, works, in their diaries and letters. Their common point was that anti-Semitism is about materialism. The Jews are materialistic and they want to bring materialism to Europe. And the only way to resist these materialistic views of Jews is to promote the ideas of spirituality. In the case of Wagner, it was the German spirituality, to promote the idea of Geist, or the spirit. And in the case of Dostoevsky, it was to promote the Russian Orthodox spirituality. So the idea of the Russian Orthodox spirituality for Dostoevsky was a kind of antidote to this poisonous Jewish materialism. At the same time, quite interestingly, both Wagner and Dostoevsky share the ideas of many advanced and progressive intellectuals of their time in promoting individual rights for Jews, because Jews were deprived of rights as a people, as a group of people in Western Europe and in Russia, similarly. And both Dostoevsky and Wagner, they argued and advocated for individual rights for Jews, for every Jews. And of course they didn't want to inflict any harm on Jews. They were quite, they were humanists. They were people who were against violence. They are only, and individually they were for the rights of Jews, for instance, to vote, to take places in public offices, and so forth. Their only concern against Jews was that the Jews are materialists, and they want to impose this materialistic worldview. For Wagner, the source of true spirituality is the German spirit, the spirit of the German nation. He believed very firmly in the universal call of the German nation to promote spirituality throughout the world, to protect. This idea goes for him back to the German idealistic philosophy. For him, the German idealist philosophers of the beginning of the 19th century, they were protagonists of the spirit, and they were just the opposite to this Jewish materialism. For Dostoevsky, it was not the German idealism, even though Dostoevsky was very much influenced by the German idealism. He never disclosed this influence in his works, but the studies of Dostoevsky, recent studies of Dostoevsky, show us how much he was under the influence of the German philosophers. At the same time, what Dostoevsky disclosed was the idea of the Russian people as the true bearers of spirituality, as God-bearer nation, Narod Bogonosets. For him, the Russian people succeeded Jews in this bearing God, because the Jews are the apostates. They betrayed Christ, that's why they betrayed God, and they turned to materialistic nation. And the successor of the Jewish people is the Russian people, Narod Bogonosets. That was the point of Dostoevsky. And for Dostoevsky, the Jews turned from the people bearing God to the people resisting God, to the Antichrist people. And he connected the idea of Antichrist with the idea of Jews. And after Dostoevsky, this anti-Christian dimension of Judaism became very much pertinent to the Russian thinking. We find many other thinkers who would interpret Jewish people in the same terms of Antichrist, of being kind of protagonists, epigones of Antichrist. This was originally the Dostoevsky's idea about Jews. I should also mention that Wagner's idea of this German spirit resisting materialistic Judaism was later on embodied in the writings of Nazi ideologies of anti-Semitism, like, for instance, Alfred Rosenberg, the chief ideologist of Hitler, of the Nazi party. He, just in tune with Wagner, he believed that the German philosophy was essentially a rebellion against the Jewish tradition. The idealistic philosophy in the beginning of the 19th century, in the writings of people like Hegel, even Kant, like Schopenhauer, it was intrinsically anti-Jewish because it promoted the idea of Geist, of the spirit, of spirituality. So we find incarnations, now violent incarnations of the same ideas of Wagner in the person of people like Rosenberg, for instance, who continued somehow the line of Wagner. And we find the incarnation, violent incarnation of the same sort of anti-Semitism that Dostoevsky promoted in the later figures, especially those who belong to the Black Hundred in the beginning of the 20th century will come. So, as I said, the intellectuals of the 19th century, like Wagner, like Dostoevsky, and earlier like Schopenhauer or Fichte, they did not want to harm Jews. They didn't want to kill them. They didn't want to extinguish them as people. They just wanted to contain them, to contain their influence, to impose restrictions on them. In a sense, they were humanists, obviously. Yes, they were not for violence, but their followers, a few decades later, embarked on violent anti-Semitism, much more violent anti-Semitism. And that's when we have a new wave of pogroms. Such a new wave of pogroms in Russia happened as a result of the defeat of Russia in the war with Japan in 1903-1906. The Russian society was deeply upset by this defeat, just as they were upset after they were defeated in the Soviet-Finnish war. And they wanted to find scapegoats for their defeat, and Jews were the ideal scapegoats for them at that time. However, the defeat in the war was not actually a pretext. It was not really the reason that they brought up to explain the pogroms. There were other reasons, like, for instance, the accusations against some Jews for killing Christian children. Right? So the war was the real reason, the resentment in the defeat of the war, but it was not an excuse to start pogroms. The excuse were a few stories, episodes when some Christian children were killed or died, and the Jews were accused of their death. Such was the famous pogrom in Chisinau in 1903. Then several Jews were accused of killing a Christian girl. She appeared to be to having committed suicide, but the people believed in Moldova, modern Moldova, that they were Jews who were behind this killing, and they launched a pogrom. And you see this picture with the bodies of Jews who were killed as a result of this pogrom. Another infamous case, which became known internationally, was the so-called Baylis case, after the name of Menachem Baylis, a Jew who lived in Kiev, and he was accused of killing a 12-year-old boy whose name was Andrei Yushchinsky. Andrei Yushchinsky was a disciple, a pupil in a church school, and his body was found in Kiev with many cuts in the body, so that blood he lost a lot of blood, and it was deemed as a ritual killing by Jews. And so this guy Menachem Beilis was accused of killing Yushchinsky. This was a very big story. It appeared in the pages of world media, and of course was very widely discussed in the Russian Empire. At this time, many prominent Russians, including advocates, intellectuals, actually advocated for Beilis. They argued that the Jews are not to be blamed for that, and there was a big process, juridical process, persecution, that found out that the Jews are innocent. Nevertheless, they did not stop the Orthodox people from persecuting Jews, and this led to pogroms that caused deaths of Jewish people. People believed at the time that in what we now call conspiracy theories, that even though there is no evidence of the involvement of Jews in this killing, they are there. That's how the idea of Jews hovering somehow invisibly around the catastrophes of the Russian history emerged. And this idea, this conspiracy theory, was fully embodied in the document which we now know as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It was proven soon after the protocols began circulating that they are a fake. It was proven actually officially. How it happened? Soon after the protocols were published, they fell to the hands of Tsar Nicholas II. He began reading them with agitation and with a pencil in his hand. He was so much fascinated that it alarmed many people in his environment. More importantly, it was not only the Tsar, and not so much the Tsar who was fascinated by the protocols, but his wife, Alexandra. She was really into it. She really believed in these protocols to the very word. And it's quite interesting. Even in the last days of the Tsars, of the Romanovs family in Ekaterinburg, when the communists executed them, then the commission found a copy of the protocols among the things of Alexandra in Ekaterinburg. So she kept this book until the last days of their life. As I said, this fascination of the Romanovs family with the protocols alarmed many people in their environment. The Prime Minister of Russia at the time, Pyotr Stolypin, ordered a special investigation by Russian spies to find out the roots of this document. And they were professionals, well, as usually the Russian spies are. And they found very easily that the protocols was a forgery. It was a fake document. Stolypin reported about this to the Tsar, but it disappointed the Tsar certainly. But certainly, well, it seems that he did not give up to believe somehow in the protocols, and certainly Alexandra never gave up to believe in the genuinity of the protocols, despite this investigation. Modern scholars still argue how the protocols were fabricated. The most common theory holds that, and this theory was articulated by Norman Cohn. Let me show you. The most theory articulated by Norman Cohn holds that the protocols were composed by the Russian Secret Service, Ochranka, under the supervision of the chief Russian spy in Paris, Pyotr Rechkovsky. This theory holds that the protocols were originally composed in France, in French language, and then translated to the Russian language. However, more recently, it was discovered that this was not true. That it seems that the protocols were composed in Russia, on the territory of the Russian Empire, somewhere on the territory of Ukraine, actually. It was composed by the Russian chauvinists. Actually, the protocol, the original text of the protocol, has some Ukrainian words in it, quite, not quite 100% High Russian language. Then they were translated into French and appeared in France, and that's how they came to believe that they were originally composed in France. The time of the composition of this text is the period between April 1902 and August 1903. So it was exactly the period before the revolution of 1905, before the first revolt against the Tsarist regime. What were the reasons of the composition of the protocols? Well, at that time, because exactly the Romanovs dynasty, the Russian monarchy, was shaken, it went through troubles. The Russian Empire was weak. Someone had to be scapegoated for that, and Jews were the ideal target. So it was a way to channel the dissatisfaction of the people in the Russian Empire to blame someone else, not the regime, not the political regime, but others, for what is going on. The protocols were first published by the Russian spiritual writer Sergei Nilus. He is here depicted on this picture. In the second edition of his book, famous book, The Great and the Small, Великое и Малое, in 1905. So it was exactly the revolt situation in Russia, and the protocols were published exactly in the time of the First Russian Revolution in order to channel the dissatisfaction of people and to bring this dissatisfaction upon others, to scapegoat Jews for the revolt. The protocols exploded as a bomb, especially among the Russian royalists, monarchists. It became a key text, a foundational text for the movement, which we know nowadays as the Black Hundred. And Nilus actually himself was a member of this movement. Probably you know that Nilus was one of those. He was one of the first who wrote about Seraphim of Sarov. He was one of those who wrote about many spiritual figures in the 19th century. He was widely respected in the Russian society, and his work, this publication, was received widely in the Russian society, and as I said, especially in the frame of the Black Hundred movement. The Black Hundred movement, as a word, as a name, goes back to the period of the Great Smuta in the Russian Tsardom in the beginning of the 17th century. And the Russians who resisted the Polish invasion to Russia, they called themselves kind of black people, Black Hundred. And the Russians in the beginning of the 20th century considered the time also as a Smuta, as a period of troubles, and called themselves Black Hundred. In the 20th century, this movement was established to support monarchy, and it was nationalistic. It was blessed by the church, which delegated to it many of its hierarchs and priests. Even such prominent figures as Jan Kronštatski was a member of Black Hundred, a very kind of faithful supporter of this movement. This movement enjoyed the support of the Tsar. It was financed from the public money and was covered by police. Actually, it had to be covered by police because it committed many terrorist actions. They were free to kill people, and police just kept a blind eye on those killings. Their main targets were not actually Jews, but all sorts of leftist guys, like students, educators, people from intelligentsia. Altogether, according to reports, they killed 1,622 people. Among them were 711 Jews. So less than half, but a considerable number of them were Jews. And unlike other targets of the Black Hundred, who were classified according to their class, they were kind of intelligentsia or they were students, Jews were targeted as a people. And that was exactly a new term in anti-Semitism, when Jews were considered in wholesale as the enemies of the Russian state as a people, not as a class. It's interesting that even if a Jew converted to Orthodoxy, or his or her ancestors were converted many years ago, decades ago, to Christianity, they were not accepted by the Black Hundred. Only non-Jews were accepted. So if, say, a super Orthodox Jew, Orthodox not in the sense of the Jewish religion but of Christianity, would want to join the Black Hundred, he would be denied this. And there were recorded instances. And that is my argument, that makes this modern anti-Semitism different from the pre-modern forms of anti-Semitism. So, as the events developed in Russia, and despite the efforts of the Black Hundred to stop anti-royalist movements in Russia, monarchy was overthrown, and the Bolsheviks took over in Russia, and this led to the splash, to a new outbreak of anti-Semitism, because the Russian Revolution, the revolutionists, many of them were Jews, and the Russian Revolution in general was described by anti-Semites as a Jewish conspiracy against the Holy Rus. This resentment against the Jews was embodied very deeply in the White movement, which was defeated by the Reds. The Whites immigrated, and they brought with them to the West the anti-Semitic conspiracies and the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Historians were able to trace the path of the protocols from Russia to Germany. They also know the name of the person responsible for that. This person is Yes, this person was Piotr Szapelski-Borg. He was a devoted royalist and a member of the Black Hundred. He even tried to rescue the Romanovs family from their captivity in Ekaterinburg, but he failed. And he was actually rescued by Germans from the territory of modern Ukraine in the winter of 1918-1919. He brought with him to Berlin this sort of propaganda that you see, and the protocols. In Berlin, his roads crossed with the roads of the German nationalist and publicist Ludwig Müller von Hausen. Von Hausen realized the value of the protocols for the rising nationalist party, and he arranged translation of the text of the protocols into German. The first accepts of the protocols appeared in the Völkische Beobachter in 1920, and then after the full text of the protocols were translated into German, they widely circulated and became really a bestseller in Germany. We know that Adolf Hitler read the protocols. Moreover, it is one of a few books that he read and quoted in his Mein Kampf book. So we find references to the protocol in Mein Kampf by Hitler. I would say that, let me just make some generalizations. I would say that if we compare what happened with the whole story in the beginning of the 20th century in Russia, all this resentment, all this scapegoating, all those fabrications, and all those inspirations for something worse, is very similar to what is happening in the beginning of the 21st century. Because I believe the protocols in the beginning of the 20th century was the first case, one of the earliest cases of what we now call post-truth. A fabricated news that fits expectations of masses who do not care about objective facts. I think the protocols was the early post-truth document, because they described something that people wanted to hear. regardless of whether it is true or not. It just fed the popular dissatisfaction. This March issue of The Economist, this one, reveals how Russia nowadays fabricates fake news in order to disseminate chaos in the West. The protocols a century ago were such a fake news, and they disseminated chaos and contributed to the most horrible tragedy of the 20th century in Europe, the Holocaust. The reason for doing this then and now is that today's Russian monarchy is weak and desperately needs scapegoats. Now the role of scapegoats is assigned to the collective West. It tries to disseminate hatred to immigrants, just as it used to disseminate hatred to Jews. Nowadays, immigrants are the modern Jews. There is another striking parallel between the protocols and our days. The most recent theories hold that the place where, as I said, where the protocols were composed was the modern Ukraine. And it was the first playground for this anti-Semitism. And Ukraine became nowadays a playground for the Russian propaganda and fake news. It's interesting that the protocols were supported not by the Ukrainian nationalists who already existed in Ukraine at the time, but the Russian chauvinists who lived in Ukraine. It's kind of a nuance, an important nuance. There were Ukrainian nationalists who were anti-Semites at the time, certainly, no doubt. But they didn't contribute to the protocols and to the dissemination of this sort of anti-Semitic propaganda. The protocols was not the only means of the Russian Orthodox influence on the Nazi ideology. In 1920, the white immigrants established in Munich a think tank which they called Aufbau. The full name is Reconstruction, Economic Political Organization for the East. Many of its members and ideas came from the Black Hundred, and many members of this Aufbau think tank were Russian Orthodox. Actually, it's interesting that Hitler came in touch with this group in 1920, and since then, the group has offered many services to his schools. I already mentioned Alfred Rosenberg, who became a chief ideologue of the Nazi Party. I just want to show him. Yeah, this is him. He was a German who was born and lived in Latvia for a long time. And he became a member of this Aufbau think tank in Munich. Another person from this group, Max von Scheubner-Richter, he was killed during the Beer Hall Putsch, and he became a model for Nazi martyrdom, and he was also a member of this Aufbau think tank. So this is Max von Scheubner-Richter is depicted somewhere here. So we can see how, yes, moreover, I read a study, an interesting study that demonstrates that before his Munich period, Hitler was not very much anti-Semitic. In his Vienna period, he rarely expressed anti-Semitic views, and he became very kind of obsessed with the anti-Semitic ideas in his Munich period. And probably one of the factors that played its role in enhancing his anti-Semitic views was exactly this contact with Aufbau group, the Russian immigrants in Munich. So we can trace the origins of the anti-Semitic, global anti-Semitic, Nazi anti-Semitic movement. On the one hand, it is rooted in the German intellectual culture of the 19th century, but not always directly. Sometimes this intellectual culture influenced the Russian intellectual culture in the 19th century, which led to the documents and theories like the expressed in the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and then influenced back the German thought. So it made a sort of detour through Russia and influenced back the German Nazi anti-Semitism. I would like to say a few words about the other instance of the of the anti-Semitism, the Romanian instance. It had the same kind of trace. It was first expressed by Romanian intellectuals in the 19th century. And it was a part of the humanistic project in Romania. One of the prominent anti-Semites in Romania at the time was this guy, whose name is Nicolae Iorga. He used to be a prime minister of Romania, but he also was a prominent Byzantologist. We know his famous work, Byzance après Byzance, which we sometimes modify as liturgy after liturgy. This phrase goes back to Iorga. And Iorga was a prominent anti-Semite. He even established a congress, International Anti-Semitic Congress, was among the co-founders of this congress. This intellectual movement in Romania, embodied in the prominent figures like Iorga, found its own violent editions, like its own versions of Black Hundred. The Romanian version of the Black Hundred was the Iron Guard. Another prominent Romanian intellectual who was also a theologian, Nikifor Krajnic, who was a professor of theology in Bucharest and Chisinau. He articulated the anti-Semitic agenda of this organization. I quoted here. The soul of the Romanian people has today inhabitants of other races and faiths as well. They came here through invasion like the Hungarians, colonization like the Germans, through crafty infiltration like the Jews. Every one of them, fonder of its own people than ours, present no guarantees of security for the official organism of the state. The Jews are a permanent danger for every national state. That is him. It's interesting. I encountered a quote from Krajnic in the work of Father Lev Gillet in his book on Jesus' Prayer. He actually forwarded his work with the quote from Nikifor Krajnic, because Krajnic was a proponent of hesychasm, of Jesus' Prayer. He was a very kind of profound spiritual writer. And this lover of Jesus' Prayer, actually his point was to make Jesus un-Jewish, to un-Jew the person of Jesus Christ. He wanted to make Jesus Christ European and not a Jew. So I cannot understand how you can, pray to Jesus in Jesus' Prayer, be a founder of hesychasm, and try to make Jesus Christ not real, not Jew. I had recently a conversation with some Romanian theologians, and they told me that there is this person of Krajnic is becoming very fashionable again. And he was not the only one who promoted the anti-Semitic ideas in Romania. Actually, the Romanian theology flourished in the interwar period. It became very prominent. This interwar period was probably one of the most prominent in the recent Romanian history. And almost every single figure in this Renaissance, theological Renaissance, was anti-Semite in Romania. The work of Krajnic just continued or copied the work of a group of an institute which was established in Germany in 1939. This institute was called the Institute for the Study and Eradication of Jewish Influence on German Church Life. It was established by Nazis, but supported by German theologians. This institute was established on the basis of the University of Jena and was led by a prominent New Testament scholar in Germany, Walter Grundmann. Their idea was exactly what Krajnic tried to prove in Romania, to prove that Jesus Christ was not a Jew, that Jesus Christ was Aryan, that actually Jesus Christ tried to overcome his Jewish identity, and the killing of Jesus Christ was a Jewish conspiracy against a non-Jew, Jesus. This institute embodied many findings of the biblical critical scholarship from the 19th century. And actually, without the biblical scholarship, I like personal biblical scholarship. I think it is a great discipline, but it should be also recognized that the biblical critical scholarship, biblical criticism in the 19th century contributed to the work of this institute in Jena, to the Jew, Jesus Christ. And exactly the same was repeated in Romania by the Orthodox theologians like Reinik, to the Jew, Jesus Christ. And considering this sort of anti-Semitism from the perspective of the Orthodox Christian Christology, I believe that anti-Semitism, as it was expressed by people like Reinik, is fundamentally heretical from the perspective of the Orthodox Christology. Because Orthodox Christology states that the incarnation was real, that the personality, the Jewish side of the human side of Jesus Christ was real, and this reality was Jewish. And if you deny Jewishness in Jesus Christ, you deny the reality of the incarnation, you become an ultra-heretic of the kind of Eutychus, not even, Severus of Antioch, the kind of Eutychus which was condemned by the Fourth Ecumenical Council. So that's why I believe anti-Semitism of this sort in the Orthodox setting is a Christological heresy. And I think if we study properly our own Christology, we can find a remedy to the Orthodox anti-Semitism. Orthodox anti-Semitism did not disappear with the end of the World War II. It resurrected together with the so-called spiritual revival in Russia, which happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Old anti-Semitic books from the period before the Bolshevik Revolution were reprinted, and new books were penned. One of the recent anti-Semitic books is the book called Russia Before the Second Coming, Россия перед вторым пришествием. This work was published by the largest Russian monastery, the Lavrovs and Sergei, in 1993. I remember I studied in the seminary in Kiev at the time, and that book was extremely popular among the seminarians and among people. Well, that was one of the most read books by the Orthodox and became an important part of the spiritual revival in Russia. It is full of quotes and so-called prophecies, often falsified and originating from unconfirmed sources. And actually, this book also included a reprint of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. An even more anti-Semitic anthology, The Mystery of Lawlessness in the Historical Ways of Russia, Тайна беззакония в исторических судьбах России, was published in 2002. It included 2 anti-Semitic articles by the Metropolitan Ion Snechov of St. Petersburg. He was an interesting guy. He did not write those articles himself. Some other people wrote. They suspect, and it's more than suspicion, that Konstantin Dushenov, a person from his circle of Ion Snechov, was the author of the writings. But Snechov actually authorized those articles. That means that he shared the anti-Semitic views. And he was the third person in the hierarchy of the Russian Church after the Patriarch of Moscow and Metropolitan of Kiev. And he was, I would say that the Orthodox Church is not just anti-Semitic. We find so many brilliant, nice people who were against anti-Semitism, who help Jews. It's not that the church is kind of doomed, condemned to be anti-Semitic. It's just the contrary. The church also shows so many examples of people who helped Jews, who died for Jews, who became righteous for among the nations, the famous title given by the Jewish center in Jerusalem to those who helped Jews. And among those people, of course, Mother Maria Skoptsova, Father Dmitry Krepinin. In Ukraine, there was a priest whose name is Alexei Glagolev, who saved many Jewish families from being sent to Babi Yar. In Greece, the Archbishop of Athens, Damaskinos, signed a letter of protest against persecutions of local Jews. Some other hierarchs of the Greek Church, such as Metropolitan of Thessaloniki Gennadios and Metropolitan of Zakynthos Chrysostomos, they offered their own life instead of the life of Jews who were captured by Nazis. In Romania, some hierarchs and priests also extended helping hand to Jews. For instance, we know about this priest. It's Father Georgie Petre, who saved so many Jews that he was granted the title of the righteous among the nations by the Jewish activists. So it's not that anti-Semitism is kind of embedded in our tradition. It is widely spread, unfortunately. And I think if we consider the remedy, as I said, I suggest against anti-Semitism is exactly to present it as a heresy. I believe it is a heresy. It is a Christological heresy. It is condemnable. It can be proven to be absolutely wrong from the perspective of our doctrine, of our Christological teaching, and I think it should be condemned like that. Thank you for your attention. It took a bit more time than I expected, to be honest. Now maybe we have a few minutes for Q&A.
Okay, thank you for the lecture. And now, as it was promised in the beginning, it's time for questions and answers, comments, facts, whatever you want to share. Now it's the opportunity. We are shy people, you know. But Teolo.
I didn't want to be the first to speak, but someone must perhaps to start. Well, thank you for your presentation. I would first add a small footnote in the protocols. One of the first translations of the protocols was published in Finland in 1919 in Swedish.
In Swedish.
And two translations based on the Swedish book appeared next year, 1920.
So it was even before the German translation.
Yeah, well, the Finnish one might have appeared before or after, I'm not quite sure.
Because the first German appearance of the protocols was in 1920.
Yeah, I know that. So the Finns or the Swedish-speaking Finns, one of them was one of the quickest translations. But they didn't have much impact in Finland. So they were at marginal in the Finnish society all the time, although there were several short versions of them which appeared in the late 20s and during the 30s. Okay, but this is
that's very interesting to know. It's important to know.
Then I would start with the concept of anti-Semitism, because I think that there are several ways to understand it. It's not only, it might be useful to divide it into pre-modern and modern, but there are, at least regarding the last, there are several ways to understand what is modern. And I think that here Western versions of anti-Semitism differ from Eastern versions a bit, because, in my opinion, the most important distinction is the concept of race, which is not so important in the Eastern versions, in Russia, even in Romania and in the lands between them. And my argument is that Eastern versions and even Orthodox versions of anti-Semitism are more close to the pre-modern versions than the Western modern versions. And your presentation somehow pointed this out too, because on several occasions you singled out the blood libel or the murder of Christian childs, which is definitely part of the pre-modern understanding of anti-Semitism. And this continued in the Eastern versions and Eastern European versions, not only Orthodox ones, but in other contexts too, until even after the Second World War. there are some accusations about killing Christian Charles. I do not go in the details there. Then, well, a few comments, a few thoughts.
Yes, I would agree completely, and I think that's yes. I wanted to indicate that the modern anti-Semitism is a secular phenomenon. Certainly, the Christian East was less secularized than the Western Europe. That's why I believe, and I concur with your argumentation, that the Western forms of anti-Semitism, even if you take Nazi anti-Semitism, it was more secular, certainly, than the anti-Semitism of Black Hundred in Russia, because the Black Hundred was a religious movement. And still my argument is that even those religious movements, like Black Hundred, they embraced a secular version of anti-Semitism somehow. They allowed something secular to penetrate their own kind of body, for them, religion, that means what? That religion per se did not mean as much for them as their kind of political agenda they promoted. So religion was a pretext, was a kind of a form for them to promote some political ideas, like the monarchical or conservative ideas. And exactly because anti-Semitism served, even secular anti-Semitism served these ends, they adopted it and they instrumentalized essentially religion for a political cause.
Yeah, I agree. There were secular versions, but I see the question a bit complicated still, because as far as I can see, the protocols, the main point, so to speak, behind the protocols was the conspiration theory, which was, and the Jews were targeted for being main culprits in this conspiration. Not because of their religion, but because they were somehow a closed nation, or as you said, quoting Fichte and others, a nation within a nation.
Yes.
And so they were not, the Black Hundreds were not thinking about Jews as religious persons. And in fact, several Jews which they attacked were not religious
at all. Yes, exactly.
And the main point was that the conspiracy was about trying to bring down the Tsardom because Jews were connected with socialism, and this was the main.
Exactly, because they explore this connection. Yes. Well, I believe that anti-Semitism, as any other populist ideology, it gives simple answers to complicated questions. And it was a very simple way to address very complicated social issues that existed in the Russian society of the time. And it was a very easy way, and people just consumed it, just like as what they do nowadays with the populist movements in the world.
Yeah. But on the other hand, you mentioned Bailey's case, and well, this brings us back to the pre-modern anti-Semitism.
Yes, I agree.
And,
yes.
The main outcome of this trial of Bailey's, perhaps besides that he was released, was that the court doomed that ritual murder is possible. Although Bailey was not accused of that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah.
But that was the point that at least which, for example, the Nazis singled out later on when their main organ, Völkischer Beobachter, published that, I think, 6-part story our history of the Baylis case, which ended with underlining the fact that Jews are capable of
doing this.
making or killing Christians.
Yeah.
How do you see, is it problematic that, for instance, the contemporary veneration of saints who have been produced by this story of Christian children killed by Jews, for instance, in Poland, Saint Gabriel is hugely popular, and the veneration is very much based on the anti-Semitist idea.
I think it should be properly deconstructed in the light of this kind of ideas and the deconstruction.
How do you treat it? How do you?
I'm not prepared to deconstruct it right now. I think it should be deconstructed, this kind of story about Saint Gabriel, somehow in the wake of what we now know and how we understand the roots of anti-Semitism. It's a big work, and it is a very sensible one because it has to do with popular piety.
Yes.
And if you touch it, just expect to be blasted out. I don't know if there is a bold enough Orthodox theologian who would do this work.
I would like to ask about the other side of the coin. Even though in Finland the Orthodox Church uses the same texts as elsewhere, and we are entering the Great Week, and it was already on the Sunday of the Cross that the Jews as a group are condemned, and there are quite harsh characterizations of them. But if you take the general overall mentality towards Jews in Finnish Christianity, what is dominating is that they are chosen nation, they are... This is not probably so strong in Orthodoxy, but there is this kind of special role of Jews and this kind of Zionistic approach, and they are considered as even more Christians in a sense, not Christians per se, but people of God.
Kind of close to God, yes.
Yes, so my question is that this is, of course, I think from the Protestant tradition, this kind of emphasis. I don't know whether it is Lutheran in a sense, but it's here in the present day Finnish society, and I think in many places in the West as well. The question is that have you discovered any such phenomena in Orthodox Christianity elsewhere, that the Orthodox Christians would appreciate Jews as a special people, or is it just like a Protestant feature?
Yes, I think you can find some such ideas among the Orthodox thinkers. It comes to my mind, for instance, the figure of Father Sergei Gakel, who passed away in the UK. He was a theologian who published widely, and I think he promoted this idea somehow. I think you can find something like that in the writings of Father Alexander Main as well. It's very much kind of
he was
held
killed because of being a Jew.
Yes.